Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here is, well, it's simple. We take a massive stack of sources and research and we distill it all down, giving you that shortcut to being truly well informed.
And today we are wrestling with a question that, it fundamentally challenges how we view ourselves.
It really does. How far will an ordinary person go when an authority figure just tells them to continue?
We are launching a deep dive into the Milgram experiment. This was a series of social psychology studies from Stanley Milgram at Yale back in the early 1960s.
And the goal was to measure the willingness of everyday people to obey instructions that went directly against their own conscience.
Directly against it.
And when you first hear about this, your immediate reaction is, oh, I would never do that. We all have this idea of ourselves as the one who would stand up, the hero.
Of course. But Milgram's results, they suggested that the situation, the context, the perceived authority, it's all far more powerful than we'd like to believe.
And the headline finding, the one that just completely rocked the world of psychology.
It was that a very, very high proportion of the subjects would fully comply. I mean, every single participant went up to 300 volts.
Every single one.
And then a staggering 65% of them continued all the way to the maximum 450-volt shock.
It's an unbelievable number. It forced this grappling with the idea that ordinary people, just like you, could become agents in a really destructive process.
You can't really talk about this experiment, though, without talking about the world it was born into.
Right. This wasn't just some abstract academic exercise. What was the historical urgency here?
The context is absolutely everything. Milgram started these experiments in August of 1961.
Okay, so 1961.
Which was just 3 months after the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the main architects of the Holocaust, began in Jerusalem.
And Eichmann's whole defense was?
I was just following orders. It was the common refrain.
So Milgram was, in a way, trying to put that specific defense under a scientific microscope.
Exactly. Was this just an excuse, or was it a genuine, measurable psychological phenomenon?
So how did they set it up?
They created this fictitious scientific study of memory and learning. It seemed benign. And there were 3 key roles.
Okay, first you had the experimenter, the authority figure.
Right. Dressed in a sharp gray lab coat. Looked the part. Instant credibility.
Then the learner.
The learner was always an actor, a Confederate hired by Milgram's team.
And finally, the teacher. This was the real person, the actual subject of the experiment.
Correct. And they had this rigged draw to assign the roles. The true subject and the actor would draw slips of paper, but both slips actually said teacher.
So the real volunteer was always guaranteed to be the one administering the punishment.
It was a crucial part of the deception. The teacher and learner were then put in adjacent rooms. The learner was strapped into this chair.
And this part is critical. Before it even began, the teacher was given a sample shock.
A sample 45-volt shock.
Yes. Wait, they're actually shocked themselves.
A real brief 45-volt shock. Milgram did this so there would be absolutely no doubt in the teacher's mind that the machine was real and that the shocks were painful.
That's a chilling detail. It immediately forces empathy. You know what the person next door is about to feel.
And then the procedure begins. The teacher reads word pairs, and for every wrong answer from the learner, the voltage has to go up.
By 15-volt increments, right?
Correct. All the way from 15 volts, which was marked slight shock, up to 450 volts, which had this ominous label, danger, severe shock, and then just XXX.
But of course, the critical deception was that the shocks weren't real.
Not after that first sample, no.
Yeah.
The learner's reactions were all pre-recorded, played from a tape recorder. It started with grunts, then protests, then screams, pleas for mercy, and finally, just silence.
And the teacher believed every single sound was real.
Which brings us to the predictions. Before he ran the full experiment, Milgram asked a bunch of experts what they thought would happen.
And they were spectacularly wrong.
I mean, it is a stunning disparity. He polled 14 senior psychology majors at Yale, people who should know. They predicted that, on average, only 1.2 out of 100 people would go to the maximum voltage.
1.2%. Basically only the extreme outliers.
And then he asked 40 psychiatrists. They predicted that only about 3.7% would continue after the 300-volt mark. And they thought less than 0.1% would administer the highest shock.
So the professional consensus was that our personal conscience, our morality, would win out.
Overwhelmingly. But the reality was the complete opposite. We know 65% went all the way.
But let's pause on that internal conflict. These weren't just, robots following orders.
Not at all. Far from it. Milgram documented extreme emotional stress. The sources talk about sweating, trembling, stuttering, groaning, even people digging their fingernails into their own skin.
And the detail that always gets me is the nervous laughter.
Yes. 14 of the 40 subjects showed definite signs of nervous laughing or smiling. It wasn't amusement. It was a psychological defense, a total breakdown of their internal moral framework clashing with the command.
They were in agony, yet they kept going.
And what kept them going were the experimenters' verbal prods. They were very specific and delivered in a sequence.
Right. It starts gently.
Please continue, or please go on.
Yeah.
If they still hesitated, it became about the institution. The experiment requires that you continue.
And then it gets more intense.
It is absolutely essential that you continue. And then the final one, the one that really diffuses all responsibility. You have no other choice. You must go on.
You're basically being told your personal feelings are irrelevant. The goal of science, of this institution, is more important.
And that framework won. As Milgram put it, stark authority was pitted against the subject's strongest moral imperatives. And authority won more often than not.
Okay, so let's really unpack this. We've laid out what happened, but the deep dive is understanding why. What is going on psychologically that lets an ordinary person just shed responsibility like that?
Milgram proposed two main theories. The first one is the theory of conformism. It's the idea that in a crisis, or when you lack expertise, you look to the group, to the hierarchy, for cues on how to behave.
That's classic social psychology. But the second one, the agentic state theory, that's what really defines this work, isn't it?
It is. Milgram said the person moves into an agentic state. They start to see themselves as just an instrument, an instrument for carrying out someone else's wishes.
So they no longer see themselves as responsible for their own actions.
Exactly. The responsibility is transferred, in their mind, to the authority figure.
So when the teacher is flipping that switch, they're not thinking, I am hurting this person. They're thinking, the experimenter is responsible for this. I'm just part of the machine.
Precisely. It's a psychological shift that allows them to continue. It explains how people can do terrible things but still see themselves as decent people. Their moral agency for that specific task is just turned off.
But here's where it gets really interesting. More recent interpretations suggest that Milgram's model might have been a bit incomplete. It might not just be blind obedience.
That's right. The newer thinking is more nuanced. One idea is something called belief perseverance.
Okay, what's that?
Well, participants walked into Yale, a respected institution, believing they were helping science. The difficulty they face isn't just moral, it's conceptual. It's the inability to accept that this benevolent authority is actually malevolent, even when the evidence, the screaming, is overwhelming.
So they're stuck on their first impression. They can't update their profile of the institution from good to bad.
And building on that is this other idea, engaged followership. Researchers went back through Milgram's archives and noticed something. People were most compliant, not when they got a simple order like you must go on.
But when?
They were most compliant when the prod stressed the scientific importance of it all. The experiment requires that you continue.
So they weren't just passively obeying. They were actively, even enthusiastically, helping to achieve the goal of science.
It shifts the whole dynamic. It's not passive compliance, it's active motivation. They identify with the leader's goals and want to help them succeed, even at a terrible cost to the learner.
That is a powerful distinction. And it immediately raises this huge ethical flag. I mean, if people are suffering that much, should the experiment have even been allowed to continue?
And that's where the massive controversy started. Diana Baumrien's criticism was probably the most famous. She focused on that extreme emotional stress. She called it inflicted insight.
Inflicted insight.
Her argument was that the experimenter had an ethical duty to stop the study the moment that distress, the sweating, the trembling became obvious.
It wasn't just about temporary discomfort. It was about the potential long-term damage of forcing someone to realize they were capable of doing that.
Absolutely. Her critique, and others like it, completely changed the game. It led to a total revision of ethical standards for psychological research. The review boards we have today are a direct result of this controversy.
How did Milgram defend himself?
He argued that the experience had a profound educational value. He did a follow-up survey, and 84% of the former participants said they were glad, or very glad, to have been a part of it.
So for some, that painful self-knowledge was actually transformative.
It seems so. There's a famous story. 6 years later, one participant wrote to Milgram. He said the experience made him realize how easily he submitted to authority. And that insight, he said, led him to become a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War.
Wow. So that inflicted insight had a real-world, positive moral impact for him.
For him, it did.
But what about the bigger question, the one that started it all? Does this experiment really explain the Holocaust?
That is fiercely, fiercely disputed. Critics like James Waller argue that it falls short. In the experiment, people were assured no permanent harm would be done. They didn't have any ideological hatred for the victim, and the whole thing was over in an hour.
Which is completely different from the years-long, hate-driven, hands-on killing required in the Holocaust.
Right. Thomas Blass, a top Milgram researcher, suggested that Milgram's model might explain the dutiful destructiveness of the dispassionate bureaucrat. The person managing the train schedules or stamping the paperwork.
But not the person who was zealously, ideologically motivated to kill.
It seems to fail there.
Yeah.
It suggests we're dealing with two different psychological phenomena: obedience to hierarchy versus ideological zeal.
Now, Milgram also ran several variations of the experiment, and these are fascinating because they show you how fragile authority can be. It's all about context.
It really is. Take prestige. When they moved the experiment from Yale to a rundown office building in Bridgeport, obedience dropped
From 65%.
down to about 47.5%. The building itself conferred legitimacy.
And what about proximity to the victim?
Huge factor. When the teacher and the learner were in the same room, so the suffering was visible, obedience dropped to 40%.
And then there was the most extreme version.
Yes, where the teacher had to physically force the learner's hand onto a shock plate. Direct physical contact.
Oh, I can't even imagine.
Compliance dropped again, down to 30%. Physical distance makes dehumanization so much easier.
But the most encouraging variation, for me, is the one that shows the power of dissent.
Oh, absolutely. When they introduced two other teachers who were actors, and those actors refused to comply and walked out.
It gave the real subject permission to do the same.
It did. Only 4 out of 40 participants continued to the end. Shared resistance is an incredibly powerful tool for breaking that agentic state.
And for anyone thinking this is just a product of the 1960s, there have been replications.
There have. In 2006, Jerry Berger did a partial replication. For ethical reasons, he had to stop at 150 volts. But up to that point, he found almost identical obedience rates. The tendency persists.
There's also that really disturbing one with a puppy.
Yes. Sheridan and King used a puppy that received real, though non-harmful shocks. They found very high compliance, especially among women. People were highly distressed, but they still obeyed, showing it's about the power of the authority structure itself.
So to sum up our deep dive, the Milgram experiment wasn't about finding sadists. It was a revelation about the profound power of context and authority. It showed that when you put an ordinary person into a rigid hierarchy,
The diffusion of responsibility is almost immediate, and their own moral compass can take a back seat to the need to follow orders.
So what's the lesson here for you, the listener?
I think the enduring lesson is this constant, difficult tension between our need to comply within a hierarchy, their agentic state, and our own individual ethics. The most dangerous obedience isn't when we're forced, it's when we are engaged, when we want to support the goals of our group or our company, and we start to rationalize that the ends justify the means.
Which raises an important question. Given how motivated we all are to support the systems we belong to, at work, in our communities, when you next face an uncomfortable moral choice, how can you tell if you are acting as a truly ethical agent, or if you're just being an enthusiastic follower supporting a system's potentially destructive goals?